1 in 4. That is the number of people in the UK today living with a disability. And yet for many, the financial systems designed to protect our assets are the very things handing a skeleton key to fraudsters. Today, we're exploring the accessibility gap, not just as a social hurdle, but as a criminal gateway. I'm Zoe Taylor, and this is Money, Crimes and Human Minds, the place where we explore real-world financial crime through the lens of human behaviour. And joining me today for this special episode is Edward Grant. Eddie, I've been so looking forward to this because you occupy a very rare and niche space, sitting right between government policy and the front lines of financial services. As the UK's government's Disability and Access Ambassador for the insurance sector and a past president of the Personal Finance Society, you are someone who must have spent decades navigating that intersection of finance and inclusion. So a massive welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm really excited to join you today.
Well, we're really glad to have you. And as I say, you've really been championing the personal finance profession for a really long time. But this ambassador role feels a bit more personal. It's quite special, isn't it? What was that moment that made you realise that accessibility wasn't just ramps and braille, but really about financial security?
So it's a very gentle way. You said I've been in the profession for a long time. That's another way of saying I'm obviously old. But yeah, I mean, yes, there's certainly a personal aspect to wanting to take on the disability and access ambassador role. I've been married 36 years. My wife, Marina, was disabled from birth. We met at school, and she was one of the first children to get into disabled children to get into a main stream school. And when she was at the school, the sixth formers used to carry her, fireman's lift carrier, up and down the stairs. So you can imagine in today's health and safety world that that wouldn't have happened. So we've come an awful long way in terms of the opportunities for disabled people, but there's more to do. And an opportunity came up, and I decided that I'd like to get involved, and it's been sort of 6 or so months, and it's been incredibly interesting meeting new people, and even for myself opening up an absolutely new world to understand, and most importantly, to find a way of connecting what's going on across the 20 ambassadors across different sectors into our sector and our profession.
Wow. That sounds like a bit of a learning curve, actually, and a lot going on. But I particularly am so glad you're here because there are some worrying trends in the financial crimes in the UK that seem to not only take advantage of vulnerable people, but also exploit those same systems and controls that are there already in place. And of course, you're now representing a sector that exists to manage uncertainty. But for millions, the system is the uncertainty. You know, when a banking app or an insurance portal is complex or hard to use, humans do what they do. They find a workaround, don't they? They will share a PIN with a carer, or they'll ask a neighbour to read a sensitive statement or document to help. But from a behavioural lens, these workarounds are definitely weak spots, aren't they? Have you seen cases like this where the industry's, creating entry points for criminals?
Absolutely. If you put friction in the process, you're quite right. People will find a way around it. But at the same time, companies are thinking about this. Not perhaps as fast as we would all like, but companies are certainly thinking about how we deal with these issues. What's really important is if you want better design, you have to put the right people in the room. And my challenge to all organizations is, when it comes to disability, is do you have disabled people or their representatives in the room? Or are you saying that we're all responsible for inclusion and hope that that gets picked up. Because in reality, unless you have true champions in the room, you don't see that. In terms of what I've seen, and the sort of sharing pins is a brilliant example, because there are schemes that a number of banks and organisations do have, where a carer's card, where you can give a carer a card that has limited money on it, that they do get a pin, they can get cash out, but it's in a controlled way. And there are cards specifically designed for this purpose. And so it's important that we actually do amplify the things that are already there. What I've noticed in my 6 months, is that there are lots of answers to problems, but no one knows about them. And I think it's really, really important. If I liken it to also to the websites that companies have, they're actually, if you look at them and you sort of said, well, are you explaining how disabled customers can utilize the facilities that can help them, or vulnerable people? On the websites, are you actually seeing information there that people can find easily? Sometimes there is information there, but it's actually in a language that is quite complicated to actually realize that it's there to help, because they use terminology which all sounds lovely, but it isn't actually explicit. So my challenge is that organizations need to be better at amplifying the great stuff that they're already doing. And the sharing of the pins and all of that is a classic example. One final bit, though, that's worth noting, and the Chartered Insurance Institute are doing a lot of thought leadership on this, is around data, and are companies using GDPR as a way of putting barriers in the way, rather than saying, right, GDPR isn't designed to do that. Can we innovate and actually remove the friction? And I think a couple of companies tend to hide behind the GDPR argument for lack of progress in some of these areas.
And it's difficult, isn't it, when that's not really wasn't ever the intention, and you sort of lose that common sense of, yes, but you can't cause harm in order to meet some, legislation that wasn't what it was designed for. And so I suppose
Yeah.
empowering and making sure that's actually happening, because there are risks around that, aren't there, if they're just letting things go unchecked under the guise of we're trying to do the right thing somewhere else.
Yes, absolutely.
So give me some examples then of what kind of things you might see. Where do you think that more vulnerable people, or people in situational vulnerability perhaps, who maybe don't even recognize that it could be an issue? You talked about jargon, and you talked about the development of AI and all of these kind of technologies, particularly when we look at economic fraud. Where do you think the weak spots are? What are the things we should be worrying about?
I think one of the biggest issues is actually either where there's family or carers actually abusing their position of trust, and economic abuse is a real problem, and it creates enormous challenges, certainly in the financial planning community, where you suspect something's going on, and it's very hard to know how you deal with that. It's hard to know who to turn to ask for help. Some local authorities are really great at safeguarding. Others, it feels harder to get them on board. What I have seen, though, that when local authorities have been involved, or the police are involved, they are very good. But there's real sensitivities. The other thing for financial planners is, if you're dealing with the family unit and you start saying that you feel a family member is leading to sort of doing economic abuse, what you're doing is basically destroying the relationship you have with the family. And what will tend to happen is actually the family just push you away because they don't maybe they don't want it highlighted as an issue. And I think some of these things start with good intentions, and then what happens is, these good intentions actually start to get carried away. But clearly, there are other examples where there are people who are malicious and abusing their situation. But I think a lot of it does actually start within the family. It's very complicated, very difficult to deal with.
It's a real problem, isn't it? And I suppose a lot of it because it's happening behind closed doors. There's not a ton of external oversight. The regulatory perspective, the Office of Public Guardian, and the Court of Protection are limited in their scope of how much they can actually really be paying attention. And certainly, in my role, I come across families every week actually who have got really a massive conflict of interest because they're attorneys and they're supposed to be acting solely in the donor's best interest, but in reality they've got one eye on their inheritance, and so there's a huge issue there, and it's often not really brought into the daylight, is it? As to the scope of that, I reckon, is far broader than any of us realise, or certainly will even go to court or get prosecuted, because unfortunately a lot of the time the donors pass away, don't they, before it actually gets to
Yes, yes, yeah,
CPS just think, well, whose interest is it to prosecute because they've inherited the rest of the money
yes.
anyway. So it is a problem, and again, it's another kind of example of well-intentioned legal powers, that we absolutely need, otherwise society wouldn't work, but also creating that dual aspect of adding another layer of complexity and another opportunity for them to be misused.
And yeah, and one example that springs to mind where the system perhaps gets it wrong. There's a great campaign at the moment led by a guy called Andrew Turner, who is looking at child trust funds. The problem is where you have a child who doesn't have capacity when they get to 18, they can't get the money out. And actually legally to get the money out, if there's only a couple of £1,000s in there, which is generally what's in the child trust fund, then it costs significantly more with most providers to get the money out. So what you have is you have some providers who are now sort of looking at the risk and think this is ridiculous, and helping people get their money out without forcing them to go through all the sort of legal loopholes to get the money out. And actually those legal loopholes are costing more than the money in the pot. So what you tend to find is you tend to find that something that you think should be so simple, so straightforward, a small pot of money just to get it out so the child can have it. You think, well, this is incredibly frustrating, shouldn't be like this, and it seems to be really difficult to resolve the problem. And then you have the other end of the spectrum where actually the people who are doing some of the most significant abuse actually have just found ways around the system. They're not following the rules. So all of these rules down one end are making it so difficult where you feel it's obvious it should be easy. And then the other end, all these rules in place, and people are basically finding ways around those rules. They're not respecting the rules or anything else. And your example of families where they're trustees and going to inherit the money is really it's a conflict, but it's a conflict perhaps you would expect a family to manage together and put the family member heart interests at heart from day one. That's what you would expect. But even that simple conflict of my inheritance first is a really complicated one.
It is, and I think that people don't actually necessarily realise that that's what they're saying. It's probably buried under there. It's often buried under the guise of, oh, but mum wouldn't want me to spend this. Mum would have wanted so-and-so to have it for her driving lessons. That's what mum would have wanted. And it's very difficult, isn't it, to kind of say, well, that may have been the case while they had capacity. Now you're in a legal role with your legal hat on. that's not an option on the table anymore. And quite frankly, if someone wanted to gift during their lifetime, well, they had capacity. Well, they would have, probably, wouldn't they? And so it's a very difficult thing to manage people's expectations. And I think generally in long-term social care, I think generally there's a lack of awareness of the cost of it, the fact that you are likely to have to pay for it, you know, the legitimate things you can do to potentially help mitigate costs. It's very unknown, despite the fact it being really quite prevalent, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately, you know, lasting power as attorneys to sit down to say who's going to advocate for me if I lose capacity. Do I trust, you know, do I trust that person? Have I explained to the person what my wishes are? So I think that what tends to happen in a number of these situations is people end up in the situation having not put the preparation in place for the potential event. And actually, the role of the financial planner in particular, and the other professionals around the client, is to put all of that in place so that there is structure. You have got the person who's going to advocate for you, and that comes back to education. That comes back to, are we spending enough time educating people? I was looking at some numbers earlier on today around disability, and roughly 16 million people in the UK would be classified as disabled. 11% of them are 11% of children, 23% are working adults, but 45% of people who are in pension age. So what you're seeing is this spectrum of disability. Now, disability can be, like vulnerability, can be incredibly wide-ranging. And you know, one of the most common one is hearing, loss of hearing as you get older. So there are things you can do to help in that situation, but also I know the banking sector have done an awful lot of work around hearing loss. Um, so and why that's important is because one of the big issues for disabled people is one of loneliness. And I think that loneliness is the thing that triggers, and hearing is actually incredibly isolating, if the person isn't helped. It's important that organizations think about how they can help, what they can do. The traditional way of presenting information needs to be adapted for the changing needs of clients. So the continual review of vulnerability and disability as clients get older or their needs change is so important. And then adapting, asking yourself, well, how have I adapted my process? How have I adapted the way I deal with that client as their needs change? Many advisors do this already. The challenge for me around some of the work that Consumer Duty has led is a number of advisors with with clients with smaller portfolios have ended up being non-advised, and therefore, how will they be supported as their needs change? And coming back to your theme of your podcast, you know that you're then vulnerable to scammers and everyone else because you've lost that connection with the advisor.
Yeah, and it's true. And from what you said earlier, you know, when the system doesn't work in the way that we think it will, and all of a sudden, oh, you can't access your money, and oh, you can't do that, and you know, there's all these rules and complexities. That then in turn makes people disengage with the likes of financial services, which are the people that can help with this in the long term. And so it's a bit of a cycle, isn't it, really, of not being able to get the right support at the right time. Then, as you say, there's a bit of an advice gap in the UK, isn't there? There's certainly not enough qualified advisors. Add into that, you know, the world of technology where we've got endless, boundless amounts of information, not always from verified sources. We've got a lot of influencing, haven't we, going on as well. So it all starts to just get a bit overwhelming, and it's very easy to feel like it makes sense that people don't really want to engage because it all just gets a bit much. And so then you do nothing, and we go back to finding all of these risks and gaps again, don't we? It's a vicious circle, really.
Absolutely, yeah.
Tell me a bit more. You mentioned something. In fact, no, you sent me a lovely email document a couple of weeks ago about the purple pound. Can you tell me a bit
Yes.
more about the purple pound, please?
Yeah, so this essentially is the calculation of that disabled people have to spend in the economy. It's probably fair to say that a lot of that money, isn't for many disabled people, and I don't want to stereotype in terms of disabled because disability is this wide spectrum, and it's worth saying if you take neurodiversity in particular, many leading entrepreneurs are neurodiverse, have been incredibly successful. But you also have the other end of disability, which is where essentially budgets are really tight. And although there's that spending power is being spent on covering your needs because the the evidence is that the cost of being disabled, you have these additional costs. The fact that, for example, London transport is not fully accessible, so you would end up spending money in other ways to compensate for what a non-disabled person would be able to do. A really good example. Me and my wife and my daughter were all going down to Waterloo on the Northern Line. My daughter could get on and get off without changing, whereas me and my wife had to take a convoluted. Now we were an extra 30 minutes, two extra trains and everything else. Now we all got to the same place. But the reality is her experience, her journey was quicker, faster, and easier, and she had time for breakfast. Whereas we arrived and we were sort of 30, 40 minutes later. That example is incredibly common for disabled people, and therefore they have that extra cost of their disability. So the purple pound simply just looks at that spending power. A really significant amount of money, and really, if you commercially, if you're an organization, you would want to tap into to the value of that spending.
Yeah, fair enough. And yes, you would think that, trying to add in a commercial incentive might well get people to deal with this. And the
Absolutely.
effect is better outcomes, isn't it? And that's kind of what we're after. And I also did statistics that also said that this group are significantly more likely to be targeted by criminals, probably for that reason. It seems like the criminals have caught on, even if the industries haven't. And I suppose what we're kind of interested in is like, these are unavoidable systems. The banking, insurance, housing, etc. These kind of big society systems are unavoidable. And I worry that, and I suppose lots of people listening will worry that unintentionally we are making people less safe by having inaccessible systems that really just weren't designed with disabled people in mind.
Yeah, and the issue for many disabled people is, and if you take the world of protection, um, uh, they struggle with financial resilience. So what happens? You take the combination that some people take. They have the combination of loneliness, a lack of financial resilience. They struggle to access things, as I said, that other people can access. When you have pre-existing conditions, and you look at life insurance, for example, or permanent health insurance or private medical insurance, it's harder to get that cover. It's harder to get travel insurance. And this is why the government have been doing a lot of work on the financial inclusion strategy, which actually requires signposting on all retail products. So signposting exists. If you are someone who's been declined or rated for life insurance, for example, or travel insurance, the insurer refers you to the signposting scheme. So Bieber has one of those schemes. They refer you to that scheme, and then the brokers on that scheme will then find a provider that will meet your needs. So they're specialists in clients who are declined or rated. Now that has been going for a number of years. Last year, they supported over 430,000 people to find cover when cover wasn't possible. And what you then what you're then seeing is that's now being expanded to all retail products. That financial resilience is so important because what's happening in the insurance sector is we're losing pooling. As there's more and more medical information, the insurers' underwriting is getting tighter and tighter, and therefore the principles of pooling are disappearing. Now, companies obviously have to make a commercial decision when they're underwriting. Everyone would expect them to do that. But the consequence is the lack of pooling, which you do get if you join a company and the company have a private medical scheme or a permanent health insurance scheme. You get the benefits of pooling in that environment. But as individuals, they're often losing those benefits. So financial resilience, really, really important. So why do they get targeted? They get targeted perhaps because they're lonely. They get targeted because they are less financial resilient. And if you're less financial resilient, then someone comes along and says, I've got the answer to your problem. That is very appealing. And it's appealing to everyone. But if you've got those set of circumstances, it could be more appealing.
And actually, there's a lot of things that spring to mind, like things like romance scams, investment scams, things where you're being overly promised and, often very much under-delivered. But you can see how that happens, can't you? That, nobody's rung for a long time. Someone's talking to you, giving you loads of attention, that flattery. You can very much see how, these systems. And isn't it sad that the criminals are recognizing them, not areas that actually they're willing to exploit, and yet sometimes it feels like the big players, the big companies, are maybe not doing as much to recognize that, not incentivized in that same way, which kind of actually brings us to this darker corner of psychology, something called mate crime instead of hate crime. We often think of criminals as these faceless hackers from another country, but in your world, actually, the predator is often the person making the tea, the people that are around behind closed doors. And when you look at the statistics, it's terrible. It's something like 80% of people with learning disabilities and autism have experienced some type of abuse. And often that is financial exploitation or theft or some kind of economic crime. And I was reading about a case. Do you remember Love Actually? The actress there, Meg Wynn Owen?
Yes.
I think she was the secretary, wasn't she, of Hugh Grant in the film. But in her case, she wasn't hacked by a stranger. She was swindled in that same power of attorney scam that we were talking about earlier. I think 65,000 in the end was taken, and that was, granted by a friend. So there's quite a lot of that predatory grooming going on, isn't there? That fear of social connections being lost or losing their independence, and a lot of that is a lot worse, a lot more terrifying than just losing money. And it does feel like there is a blindness to that kind of fraud that you're talking about, that sort of intimate, behind the scenes, personal fraud, and probably a lack of reporting, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know there's a lot of excitement about AI and other forms of technology, which are incredibly helpful for disabled people. Technology has really helped open up massive opportunity for disabled people. So there's a really good plus side to it. And it's also worth just remembering that people have always, scammed. What's happening is there's new tools to do it. There's new ways of doing it. Technology is allowing people who've always been going down these routes. They're now using technology that's now more sophisticated. You're watching videos of famous people who you think are doing a video promoting something or whatever. The technology is making it easier to scam. However, government is starting to realize that they have a role in legislating, in ensuring that actually the vulnerable don't get exposed to this. And obviously, we're seeing a lot at the moment around children and social media, and different countries banning children from going on social media. So what we've got is a realization that government can do more, and they are seeking to do more in varying degrees, but they are certainly seeking to do that. And yes, the friend who's trusted, the friend, and I think in this case of Meg Owen, the friend who she gave the power of attorney to, it's really, really difficult when the person is given that authority. Who is going to advocate for her? Now, in this case, someone did advocate for her, and he was prosecuted. But it's a really hard thing to actually do and progress. And I suspect that the amount of cases that come to court like this is probably quite limited.
Yes, I agree. And actually, next week, I am fortunate enough to be speaking to a DTI who is actually a senior investigating officer of economic crime. And that is one of the things we're going to talk about is that reporting gap and, the things that we can do to override that, really, because, there is a difficulty with oversight, with things happening behind closed doors, and with also people not reporting it because they have some feelings of shame, or, they feel daft, and even
Yeah.
particularly, I think, with disabled people or people with maybe some cognitive impairments, that kind of thing. They worry that someone's going to say, "Oh, you're not capable of looking after your money anymore, or you're not, going to be well enough to do certain things, or you shouldn't really be living independently anymore." There's a lot of fear there that makes people stay very silent, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it's not just disabled people. There's many husband and wives and partners who are living together where one person is more excited about doing the finances than the other person. And then when the person who was doing the finances dies, the other person has to work out what's going on, what do they have to do. Sometimes they work it out themselves. Sometimes they rely on someone else to help them. Um, and actually, for me, the answer is better education. For me, the answer is to make sure if you've got the clients in front of you, to make sure that both of them really understand that you're not talking to one, you're talking to both of them, that you are making sure that there's an element of independence there, that they can access the banking app together. These are simple things, but what it does is build confidence. And actually, at some point, um, that one of them will die, and therefore the other one will be left. And they will have to work. They will have to work it out, or people will need to help them to do that. One of the things I've been doing for the last 5 or 6 years, because of my background, my job, been heavily involved in the financial planning sector, and I have been the one that's been sort of doing all the financial stuff. But the thing that I have spent the last 5 years making sure that I've put in place is to make sure that my wife does know, if I'm not here, what would she do? What is the plan? Has she know how to access everything? Where will she find, um, passwords and all that sort of stuff? And I think that's a really important part of that financial planning. It goes hand in hand with the power of attorneys. Um, and that groundwork is so important so that people don't feel isolated and feel silly when they're left in that situation. It's compounded and it's really important. Disability so broad from where there's mobility issues to capacity issues. So what's important in my experience is to understand what the needs are for that individual, and and actually thinking about what reasonable adjustments we can make as a profession to help that particular client not feel silly, to give them the confidence. And a lot of the work can be done many years in advance to when actually it becomes a real pressing need.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that I am absolutely fascinated by human behaviour. And you mentioned something there about there being a couple and sort of one's definitely more engaged or definitely sort of asking more pertinent questions, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. And not always sure, are you, if the other half of that couple is just nodding along. And one of the
Yes.
things that I have been researching is sort of labelled broadly as impression management, which from what I've been reading is like a broad term that influences, the perceptions of other people. So someone's
Yes.
regulating and controlling their own behaviour in social situations to sort of change other people's perceptions. And
Yes.
I like in that example of just sort of nodding along, because of course
Yes.
we do want to blend in, don't we? And there could be this desire to mask or to regulate how we come
Yes.
across so that you don't appear to be vulnerable or different. But
Yes.
that in itself, I just imagine if I was sat in a lawyer's office or a financial advisor's office and I'm masking away because I don't want to be patronized or thought differently of, and am I effectively then just leaving myself wide open to fraud by pretending to understand things that in reality I might not have?
Look, there's always that possibility. I think that if I flip it around and say, what's the role of the advisor in that situation? Um, and also, understanding when it comes to disability, understanding who's most likely to do that. So, for example, neurodiverse people um, uh, will probably do that in that situation. Um, and certainly with ADHD, it's definitely a trait where people will want to fit in, um, will self-doubt themselves, so won't want to challenge or ask questions. So I think the issue comes back to the advisor needs to ensure that they're asking the questions, they're checking in, they're asking the person to tell to check in their understanding, repeat back the themes of what I've just explained. And also this continuous reminder, if there is a plan, reminding someone what the plan is, so that they don't if it's neurodiversity, so they don't deviate from the plan that was agreed without coming back and talking through. So I think there's much can be done. Ultimately, we're all vulnerable to scams. Only this week, uh, I got something that looked like it was from my accountant to sign off my accounts. You know, if I hadn't been on so many, scam email phishing courses to tell me what not to do, I would have clicked the button. But it was obvious to me, and I probably get two or three different things a week that if I click on would probably leave me vulnerable. And I'm sure other people are getting more and more and more. So I think the reality is we need to educate people to be better at taking precautions. Um, and my father-in-law, before he died, rang me up once to ask me. He said he just got an email from Lloyd's Bank about his account. Should he click on the link? And I said to him, "Well, you don't have a Lloyd's Bank account, so it's probably not worth clicking on the link because you don't even have the account." The fact that we had said to him, "Don't click on anything," he stopped and he asked, and then he just deleted it. These things are so sophisticated now. It only through education can we stop people from falling into difficult circumstances.
Yeah. So tell me then, if there was a couple of like practical things that you think the listeners should be remembering from today in order to kind of mind the money and watch the mind, what would you say to them to kind of look out for?
So for me, the couple of things would definitely be, if I was an advisor, to make sure that I have really understood my client in terms of vulnerability, in terms of disability, in terms of the needs, how to address that. So that would be for me, if I was an advisor, the thing I would really want to do. If I was an individual, I would spend as much possible time trying to educate myself on scams, how not to fall foul of them, and obviously do that housekeeping early, get that lasting power of attorney in place, make sure I have found the trusted person that I want to advocate for me. And I tell them in advance what it is I would do so that when they come to make the decision on my behalf, they have a good sense of what I'm likely to want to do. There's no point appointing someone to be your attorney if you don't explain to them what you're likely to want and do. And therefore that's, I think, is really, really important. Um,
There's a lot of preparedness, isn't there? And what you said about making sure that your wife was kind of prepared, it's a really loving, lovely gesture. I think people are so like frightened of talking about death in case it happens. You know, I've got clients now who wouldn't make a will for 20 years in case they drop down dead the day after, almost superstitious, you know, but it makes such a big difference, doesn't it, to that preparedness? And I think it's such a lovely thing to leave behind, to think, oh gosh, you know, he had this all organized. He wanted us to be comfortable and to be safe and to be happy and to know what we were doing. And I think that's a lovely thing, really.
there's a great book which is The Swedish Death Cleaning, which is so as a woman, she was about 80 when her husband died, and basically it was about, talks about what she's been doing to get herself ready, um, uh, and passing on, and there's simple housekeeping stuff, which is, just, do you need 24 plates anymore? Um, so she's been cleaning a house out. She's also, she allocates boxes and she says this box is for this child and this box is for that child. So, it's quite extreme. But what she does is she prepares, she gets everything ready. She's written a couple of books, and it really, really good because it gets you into the mindset of if you want to create a legacy, if you want to ensure that there's someone advocating for you, then you've got to put the building blocks in place, and that and ultimately, I know you're a financial advisor, and you'll know the true value of advice um, in the client relationships that you've got. But it's incredibly powerful because the financial planner is an enabler for your wishes. They're there to help and oversee, and so it's really important that they are involved and they help you facilitate the things that you want, and they become part of that trusted group around you when the need comes.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And you know, I went to see one of my older clients, and she was in her 90s, and she was watching the TV, and I said, "Oh, what are you watching like you do while we were getting a cup of tea?" And it was I think it was in New Zealand. It was a group of people who were previously really very lonely, and they had basically banded together in this massive warehouse. And it sounds a bit bizarre, really, but they were all sculpting and crafting their own coffins. And
Right.
it was lovely because they would go there and they would talk about what they wanted, and every coffin was very individual, you know, decorated by with whatever meant something to them. And you know, it was the most uplifting thing I've ever seen for such what should have been a quite a serious thing. Oh, but it's lovely, isn't it? And talking of tea, because I know that you're secretly a qualified tea sommelier, is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been drinking my as it is. I've been drinking my tea. Yeah, look, I had a passion for tea, and I went off and did a tea sommelier course, and and actually. It's fantastic. It's fantastic for mindfulness. If most people, they get a tea bag and they throw it in a cup, put boiling hot water on 30 seconds, splash some milk in, and that's a cup of tea. And I'm not saying that's bad because that's 90% of the population. The way I make my tea is I choose my tea from about 50 different teas, depending on my mood, which then determines what temperature it's boiled at. And I have a kettle that does the different temperatures. You smell the tea. You can look at the tea. You can brew it for as long, depending on what you want in different temperatures. And actually, for me, making a cup of tea is about a 5 minute exercise. And actually, I will brew the same leaves over many days, and get 5 or 6 brews out of them. So for me, there's a little bit more excitement and a journey, and the flavors are thousands of different teas, and the flavors are really exciting, and without wanting to cry tea bags, but it's a tea bag is essentially taking 5 bottles of wine, pouring it in a bucket, and drinking the mixed wine because it's just a blend of different tea leaves and flavors. Whereas I tend to drink stuff from one tea garden, prepared in its own individual way. but I don't want to decry the tea bag because I'll upset 90% of the population.
It's a functional means to an end for a cup of tea, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. And I do drink, I've had several cups of ordinary builder's tea this week. So although I'm probably a nightmare to make a cup of tea for, people get very nervous when they make a cup of tea for me.
I can imagine. Whereas you see at work, we just decide if the tea looks all right, if it's kind of the colour of the desk, that's kind of the size. Oh, well, I just think this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your incredibly busy and very, respectable occupations to come and talk to me. And I just, think that it's a topic that I wish we would talk more about. I think it's talked about very flippantly. Oh, it's just a little scam. Oh, it was just a little cheeky attempt to, pilfer your life savings. And it's really much more serious than that. And this has really been a masterclass in why that accessibility gap is everybody's problem, not just a social one.
Brilliant. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for coming. And this is Money, Crimes and Human Minds. Please join us again next Wednesday for our weekly short report. And don't miss next month's special guest. As I mentioned, it is the Senior Investigating Officer of the Major Crime Unit on the front lines of economic crime. So one not to be missed. If you could please like, subscribe, and remember, mind the money and watch the mind. See you on Wednesday.